Welcome back to the Doctrine Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're tackling, I think, one of the most dramatic shifts in the history of the global political economy.
It's a huge topic.
It is. And to really get the scale of what we're talking about, you almost have to strip away our modern image of East Asia.
Right. Forget the skyscrapers or the bullet trains for a second.
Exactly. If you were standing in, say, Seoul or Taipei in 1953, you are not seeing any of that. You're seeing just devastation.
Absolute devastation. I mean, South Korea had a lower GDP per capita than Haiti.
Lower than Haiti or Ghana. Japan was, still clearing rubble from firebombing and nuclear attacks. And
Taiwan was basically this island refuge for a defeated government dealing with hyperinflation. These were not places you'd bet on.
No. By all conventional economic indicators, they should have been on the periphery for, a century.
It's hard to overstate how bleak it was. If you read the World Bank reports from the late 1950s about South Korea, they're just brutal.
What do they say?
They basically say the country has almost no potential for economic development. They recommended just, stick to agriculture and rely on foreign aid.
And yet, and this is the core of it, in the span of a single generation, 30 years maybe?
Roughly, yeah.
These nations didn't just survive. They engineered what we now call the East Asian miracle.
From agrarian poverty to global leaders in steel, ships, cars, semiconductors, it's an unprecedented leap.
So we're going to explore how that happened. And we want to move past the simple answers, like hard work or free markets.
Right, because it's so much more complicated than that.
We're investigating this thing called the developmental state. Was this miracle actually a calculated government strategy? A strategy that, by the way, violated pretty much every rule of Western capitalism.
And maybe the more uncomfortable question, was this whole economic model actually a product of American Cold War strategy?
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it?
It is. We have this story we tell ourselves, that capitalism brings democracy, that the free market is the only way to get rich.
Mm-hmm.
But the East Asian experience, it suggests a different path, a path where the state is in the driver's seat, guiding the market.
Okay, so to guide us through this, we have a really solid stack of scholarship. We're not just, skimming the surface today.
No, we're going deep.
We are. So we're anchoring this deep dive on 4, I'd say, seminal texts and a specific set of lecture materials.
Sounds good.
First, for the big geopolitical picture, we have U.S. Grand Strategy and the Origins of the Developmental State by James Lee. That was published in the Journal of Strategic Studies in 2019.
And that one is crucial. It really frames the whole Cold War discussion.
It does. Then, to understand the prototype, the Japanese model, we're using Revisiting the Japanese Economic Model by T.J. Pemple from 2005.
Pemple is essential for the institutional mechanics, the nuts and bolts of how it worked.
Right. But we also need the economics, and that's where Donnie Roderick comes in. We're looking at his 1995 paper, Getting Interventions Right, How South Korea and Taiwan Grew Rich.
And Roderick, he just turns a lot of the conventional wisdom about exports completely on its head.
He really does. And then finally, to bring this into the modern era with China, we have How the World Trade Organization Changed China by Yelling Tan. That's from Foreign Affairs 2021.
And to tie it all together with some great data visualization, we're also pulling from the course slides from Dr. Jack Zhang's module on the international relations of Asia.
Right. The slides have some charts that are they make things so clear.
They really do.
So let's start with the definition. We keep using this term developmental state. I think a lot of people might hear that and immediately think socialism or communism.
That's the first hurdle, and it's the most common misconception.
But T.J. Pemple says it's something totally different.
It's something else entirely. The developmental state is, and this is key, decidedly capitalist.
So private property exists, private companies.
Absolutely. Private property, private profit corporations are the main actors.
Yeah.
But, and this is the big but, unlike the regulatory state that you'd see in the U.S. or the U.K.
Where the government is more like a referee.
Exactly. The government sets the rules of the game and then steps back. It lets the market figure out who wins and who loses.
Okay.
The developmental state is interventionist. The government's whole legitimacy, its reason for being, isn't just about keeping the peace. It's about delivering rapid economic growth.
So the state has a goal.
A very explicit goal. Catch up. Catch up with the advanced West as fast as humanly possible.
So the government isn't a referee. They're, the head coach calling all the plays.
That's a great way to put it. And Pem lays out the specific plays for the Japanese model, which really became the prototype for everyone else.
Okay.
He talks about this concept of embedded autonomy.
But that sounds very academic.
It does, but the idea is actually quite social. It's about the bureaucrats.
The people running the ministries.
Right. In Japan, the bureaucrats at, say, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry or the Ministry of Finance, these were the absolute best and brightest, the elite of the elite.
Where do they come from?
They all graduated from the University of Tokyo. And crucially, so did the CEOs of all the major corporations they were regulating.
So they're all part of the same club.
Exactly. Pemble calls it a club-like atmosphere. They were embedded with the business sector. They went to the same schools. They knew each other. They trusted each other.
Okay, that's the embedded part. What about the autonomy?
The autonomy is just as important.
Mm.
In the U.S., a regulator tries to do something, and an industry can just go hire lobbyists, pressure Congress, and get the politician to shut the regulator down.
Right, the revolving door.
Pemble argues the Japanese bureaucrats were insulated from that kind of political pressure.
How?
Because of the way the Liberal Democratic Party basically ruled Japan as a single-party state for decades. The bureaucrats could make 5-year, 10-year economic plans without having to worry about the next election.
So they could think long-term.
They could prioritize long-term industrial growth over short-term things, like, say, consumer welfare.
Which brings us to the second pillar Pemble talks about, protectionism.
Right. Keep foreign goods out to protect your infant industries. That's pretty standard stuff for a developing country.
But the third pillar, financial control. That seems to be the real superpower here.
That is the lever of power. It wasn't just about tariffs. It was about controlling the money, the lifeblood.
How did they do it?
The government, through the central bank and what was called administrative guidance, basically told the private banks where to lend money.
So they could just direct capital.
They could. If the Ministry of International Trade and Industry decided that Japan needed to become a world leader in shipbuilding, then suddenly all the banks would start offering super low-interest loans to shipbuilding companies.
And what if you wanted to do something else?
Let's say you wanted to start a company importing luxury French handbags. You'd find it almost impossible to get a loan.
Wow.
The state literally rigged the financial system to channel all the country's resources into what it considered strategic industries.
It sounds incredibly efficient if you're one of those chosen industries.
Oh, absolutely.
But Pemble uses this term that really sticks with me, the golden straitjacket. It's a great phrase.
It is.
It implies this massive trade-off. We see the gold tote, the skyscrapers, the high-tech exports, but who is wearing the straitjacket?
The average citizen, the consumer.
In what way?
This model prioritizes the producer over the consumer, always. For decades, Japanese citizens paid way more for things like rice, cars, and TVs than people in the U.S. did.
Because the market was closed to competition.
Right. There were no cheap imports to drive prices down. Pemble also highlights the gendered aspect of this.
What do you mean?
The whole model relied on a core workforce of men who had lifetime employment. But it used women as a buffer workforce.
A buffer.
Low-paid temporary jobs, and they were always the first to be fired during any economic downturn. So the miracle was really built on a very rigid and I'd say exclusionary social hierarchy.
It effectively locked half the population out of the core benefits of that stability.
That's a good way to put it.
Now, when we talk about this model, with Japan leading and then the Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan following, there's this analogy that always comes up.
The flying geese.
The flying geese. Dr. Zhang has this in his slides. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. It's a visual metaphor. The idea is that Japan is the lead goose in the V formation.
Okay.
Japan moves into a high-tech industry, like automobiles. As it does that, it vacates the lower-tech industries it used to dominate, like, say, textiles or basic steel.
And the other geese move up to fill that spot.
Exactly. South Korea and Taiwan then move into steel and textiles.
Mm-hmm.
Then as they move up to cars, they pass textiles down to, say, Thailand or Indonesia.
So it suggests this harmonious, orderly progression of development.
Right. Everyone kind of rises together in formation.
Yeah.
But, as we're going to discuss later when we get to China, that formation is now completely breaking down.
How so?
China doesn't want to be a follower goose. It wants to lead the whole flock, and it wants to do it now.
Okay, we'll get to China. But before we do, I want to go back and really challenge the origin story of this whole model.
Right.
We've described the what, the bureaucrats, the protectionism, the finance, but the why. This is where James Lee's research in the Journal of Strategic Studies just completely changed my perspective on all of this.
It's a game changer of an article.
It is. We tend to think of these economic policies as purely domestic choices. But Lee's argument is that you simply cannot understand the developmental state without understanding American grand strategy during the Cold War.
This is the critical geopolitical layer. Lee argues that the developmental state wasn't just, tolerated by the United States. In many ways, it was architected and funded by the United States.
That seems so counterintuitive. The U.S., the champion of the free market.
You have to remember the context. It's the late 1940s, early 1950s. The U.S. is terrified of the domino effect.
Communism spreading across Asia.
The Soviet Union is a threat, and the People's Republic of China is newly communist. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are what Lee calls frontline states.
They are literally the geographical barrier between the communist bloc and the Pacific Ocean.
Exactly. And the U.S. had this realization. Poverty is the single best recruiting tool for communism.
Right.
If you're a landless, starving peasant in South Korea in 1953, and the communists from the north promise you land and food, that is a very compelling offer.
So the U.S. decided that economic stability was a weapon.
It was a security imperative. For these frontline states, rapid economic growth was more important than free market ideology.
And this is where the comparison Lee makes between the frontline states and the Philippines becomes so damning.
It's a perfect natural experiment.
Talk about that, because in the 1950s, the Philippines was arguably in a much better position for growth than Korea was.
It absolutely was. It was a former U.S. colony. English was widely spoken. It had democratic institutions, a similar population size.
So why didn't it become an Asian tiger?
According to Lee, it all comes down to threat perception.
How scared the U.S. was.
Basically, yes. In the Philippines, there was a communist insurgency, the Huk Rebellion. But Lee details how U.S. intelligence assessments at the time viewed the Huks as a contained threat, a manageable one.
Why?
The Philippines is an archipelago.
Right.
It's much harder for a rebellion to coordinate across all those islands, and they didn't have a direct land border with China or Russia where they could get supplies and support.
So the U.S. felt the Philippines was relatively safe.
Right. And because they felt it was safe from a total communist takeover, they didn't intervene heavily in its economy. They basically let the local Philippine elite, the wealthy landed aristocracy, continue to run the show.
And now contrast that with Korea and Taiwan.
A completely different story. In Korea and Taiwan, the communist threat was existential. The enemy was right across the border, or right across the strait.
So the U.S. couldn't afford to be hands-off.
They were anything but. The U.S. aid agencies, like the International Cooperation Administration, were ruthless. They weren't just writing checks. Lee shows they were practically co-writing the economic 5-year plans for these countries.
And what was the biggest, most radical thing they pushed through?
Land reform. Without a doubt.
I want to really drill down on this because it sounds kind of, agricultural and benign. But it was a violent restructuring of society, wasn't it?
It was absolutely revolutionary. In South Korea and Taiwan, under immense U.S. pressure, the governments forcibly purchased huge tracts of land from the wealthy landlords.
Forcibly.
And then they redistributed that land in small parcels to the tenant farmers who'd been working it. We're talking about strict limits. In some cases, you couldn't own more than 3 hectares of farmland.
And this did 2 things.
2 crucial things. First, politically, it inoculated the peasantry against the appeal of communism. Why join a revolution when you now own your own land?
It killed the insurgency's support base.
Instantly. But second, and this is the economically critical part, it destroyed the political and economic power of the old landlord class.
And that's the key difference with the Philippines.
That's the key. In the Philippines, the U.S. didn't force land reform, so the wealthy landlords kept their land and their power.
And they had no interest in building factories.
None. Their wealth came from their sugar plantations. They were happy with the status quo.
Yeah.
In Korea and Taiwan, once the landlords lost their land, they were given government bonds in exchange. If you wanted to make money again, they had no choice but to sell those bonds and invest in industry.
So the U.S. intervention literally forced capital to move out of agriculture and into industry.
Precisely. And it's just this supreme irony of history. The United States, the world's champion of capitalism and private property rights, effectively forced a massive state-led redistribution of wealth in East Asia, all to save it from communism.
It really suggests that the miracle wasn't just about culture or, the Confucian work ethic we always hear about.
At all.
It was about being in such immediate existential danger that the global superpower gave you a blank check and the political cover to completely restructure your society from the ground up.
And on top of that, provided the military security umbrella so you didn't have to spend your entire budget on defense. You could spend it on roads, ports, and schools instead.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit to the mechanics of that growth.
Sure.
There's this very popular myth that the Asian tigers just got rich by exporting cheap stuff, make cheap toys, sell them to Walmart, profit.
The export-led growth model.
Right. But Denny Roderick's paper, Getting Interventions Right, he basically argues that the export boom was a symptom, not the cause.
Roderick is really doing a brilliant job of dismantling the standard neoclassical economic view here.
What's that standard view?
The standard story is that these governments just liberalize trade, remove barriers, and then the private sector, seeing the opportunity, just rushed in to start exporting to the West.
Sounds simple enough.
But Roderick looks at the actual data, the numbers, and says the timeline just doesn't fit. The profitability of exporting was actually quite low when the big growth spurt started in the 60s.
So if it wasn't exports, what was it?
The real engine, he argues, was a massive state-led investment boom.
Okay. Roger talks about something he calls coordination failure as the central problem the state had to solve. Can we put that in concrete terms? Why would the market fail to coordinate on its own?
Yeah, let's use the famous example. The steel industry in South Korea, and specifically the company POSCO.
Okay.
In the 1960s, South Korea decided it wanted to build a big, modern, integrated steel mill.
A huge investment.
Massive. So they went to the World Bank to ask for a loan. And the World Bank, they crunched the numbers, they did their analysis, and they came back and said, absolutely not.
Why?
They said, this is a terrible idea. You have no iron ore, you have no coking coal, and most importantly, you have no domestic demand for steel. You'll go bankrupt.
And from a pure free market perspective, the World Bank was right. It made no economic sense.
Exactly. It's the classic chicken and egg problem.
Ah.
Or as Roderick would call it, a coordination failure.
Explain that.
A private investor isn't going to risk building a giant steel mill unless they know there are car factories and shipyards ready to buy all that steel.
Right.
But a private investor isn't going to build a car factory unless they know they can get a reliable supply of cheap, high-quality steel.
So everyone waits for everyone else to go first.
And nothing gets built. That's the coordination failure, a market standoff.
So the Korean state, under General Park Chung-hee, stepped in to break that standoff.
He effectively said, we're doing this regardless. The government mobilized the capital, it guaranteed the loans, it provided the land, and it essentially ordered the creation of POSCO.
But that only solves the supply side. What about the demand?
The state created that too. It ensured that other new industries, Hyundai and shipbuilding, Hyundai and automobiles, would be there to buy the steel from POSCO. The state coordinated both the supply and the demand simultaneously.
Which is something the private market just couldn't do on its own.
That's Roderick's core argument. The government acted as a coordination mechanism to jumpstart industrialization.
Okay, but once you have these big state-backed companies like POSCO or Hyundai, how do you stop them from getting lazy and inefficient? I mean, if the government guarantees your profits, why bother to innovate or control costs?
That is the million-dollar question. And this is where Roderick's concept of the carrot and stick comes in. It's the genius of the East Asian model.
What does he mean by that?
In many other developing regions, like Latin America at the time, governments also gave subsidies to industries. That's the carrot.
Mm-hmm.
But they often asked for nothing in return. So you ended up with these bloated, inefficient, state-protected companies that could never compete globally.
So East Asia did it differently.
They did. The subsidies, the cheap loans, the tax breaks, they came with a stick. The government said, we will give you this carrot, but you must meet strict performance standards.
And what were those standards?
Usually the standard was export performance.
Ah, so that's where exports come back into the picture.
Yes. Even if the export sector wasn't the main source of profit in the early days, it served as the ultimate impartial yardstick for performance.
How so?
Well, you can lie to a government bureaucrat. You can fudge your numbers, but you can't lie to the American consumer.
Right.
If you can sell your Hyundai car in California in a market where you're competing against Ford and Toyota and Volkswagen, it proves your car is actually good.
So it forced them to compete with the best in the world.
It did. And if you failed to meet your export targets, the government would pull your subsidies. They would cut off your credit. It was a ruthless, state-enforced meritocracy.
Okay, let's fast forward. From the 20th century to the 21st, we absolutely have to talk about China.
The elephant in the room.
China is the ultimate test case for this model, right? Did they just copy the Japanese and Korean playbook page for page?
They definitely started by copying the playbook. Export processing zones, state control of finance, protecting domestic industries.
But the context was totally different.
Completely. By the time China really hit the accelerator in the 1990s and 2000s, the Cold War was over. The world was globalizing. And the big turning point, the pivotal moment, was China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001.
I remember the optimism back then. The theory was engagement.
It was the consensus view in the West.
The idea was, if we just let China into the WTO, the strict rules of the organization would force China to liberalize. They'd have to lower their tariffs, stop subsidizing their state-owned companies.
And eventually, they'd start to look and act just like a Western market economy.
That was the gamble. Yellington's article, How the WTO Changed China, it paints a much more complex picture.
It does. Tan described the initial phase, in the early 2000s, as a genuinely liberalizing trend. The central government in Beijing actually used the WTO rules as a club to beat its own local governments into submission.
How do you mean?
To force them to lower internal trade barriers, to clean up regulations, to be more transparent. For a few years there, it really looked like the convergence theory was working.
But Tan argues that this trend didn't just stop, it reversed. The Chinese state didn't retreat, it mutated.
Exactly. The state learned how to play the game. It learned how to operate within the WTO system while still achieving its developmental goals.
So they moved away from the obvious stuff.
Right. They moved away from simple, visible tools like high import tariffs, which the WTO explicitly bans, and they shifted towards much more subtle, harder-to-police tools.
Like what?
Non-tariff barriers, unique technical standards that favor domestic firms, anti-monopoly investigations that just happen to target foreign companies, and most importantly, these massive state guidance funds for investment.
So instead of a command economy, China developed what Tan calls state capitalism 2.0.
A much more sophisticated version.
Which brings us directly to Made in China 2025. Dr. Zhang highlights this heavily in his course materials. This policy seems like the moment China officially declared it was done catching up.
I think that's a perfect way to describe it. Made in China 2025 is the moment the flying geese formation just fell apart.
Because China said, we're not waiting our turn.
China said, we're not going to wait for the US or Japan or Germany to pass down advanced technology to us anymore. We're going to build it ourselves, and we're going to dominate those sectors globally.
And the policy is incredibly specific about those sectors.
10 key sectors. Things like information technology, robotics, aerospace, new energy vehicles, high-tech ships.
And the goals are so ambitious. I was looking at the bar charts in Dr. Zhang's slides. They're not just saying we want to get better at this. They are setting explicit domestic market share targets.
Targets of 70–80% for things like industrial robots and electric cars.
That's basically saying we want to push foreign companies out of our domestic market.
It is an import substitution plan on a global, massive scale. The goal is to replace foreign technology with domestic technology across the board.
And this is why the geopolitical friction with the U.S. is so high right now.
This is the core of it. When South Korea was building ships in the 1970s, that wasn't really a threat to the core of the American economy.
Right.
But when China says it wants to dominate artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and semiconductors, that strikes directly at the heart of American economic and military superiority.
And what makes this friction so complicated is how deeply integrated our economies already are. Dr. Zhang uses the iPhone example in his slides to illustrate these global value chains. I think this is so important for people to understand because the trade deficit numbers we hear on the news are, well, they're just wildly misleading.
They are incredibly misleading. Let's just break down the iPhone example from those slides.
Please.
So, when a fully assembled iPhone is shipped from a factory in China to the U.S., the customs declaration says the value is about $179.
Okay, this is for an older model, but the principle is the same.
Right, so in the trade statistics, it looks like the U.S. just imported $179 worth of Chinese goods.
Which contributes to that huge trade deficit that politicians are always talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, and this is the key, if you actually look at the value added, who actually got paid for making the components of that phone, China's share was only about $6.50.
Wait, $6 out of almost $200?
$6.50. That was the labor cost for the workers assembling all the parts in the factory in Shenzhen.
So where did the other $170 go?
It went all over the world. It went to Japan, to South Korea, to Taiwan, to Germany. and to the United States itself.
For the high-tech parts.
For the high-tech parts.
Yeah.
Japan provided the display and the camera. That was about 34% of the value. Germany provided advanced sensors. South Korea provided the memory chips. And the U.S., Apple, provided the design, the software, the intellectual property.
So China was just the final assembly point.
Right. This is what Dr. Zhang calls Factory Asia. It's not one country making one thing. It's a complex, integrated production network that spans the entire region.
And this means that if the U.S. slaps a huge tariff on Chinese electronics...
You're not just punishing China. You're inadvertently punishing your allies in Japan and South Korea, and you're even punishing your own American companies that design the products.
Because the supply chain is so fragmented and interconnected.
Precisely. You can't just surgically remove China from the global economy without severing the arteries of this entire East Asian production network.
This complexity creates what Dr. Zhang calls the noodle bowl effect when it comes to trade agreements.
I love that visual.
It's so good. He says it's a noodle bowl as opposed to a spaghetti bowl.
It's a messy, tangled mess.
Yeah.
Unlike the European Union, which is a single, clean, integrated market.
Right.
Asia has hundreds of overlapping bilateral and multilateral trade deals. ASEAN has a deal with China. Japan has a separate deal with Singapore. Australia is in the RCEP. If you try to draw lines connecting all these deals on a map, it just looks like a bowl of noodles.
A compliance nightmare for any business trying to operate there.
A total nightmare. But here's the paradox. You have this economic noodle bowl where everyone is trading with everyone, and China is increasingly the biggest trading partner for almost every country in the region.
But the security architecture is completely different.
Completely different. Dr. Zhang calls the security system the hub and spokes system.
What does that look like?
It looks like a bicycle wheel. The United States is the hub at the center. The spokes are our individual treaty allies: Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, Thailand.
And the spokes are all connected to the U.S. hub.
But they are not necessarily connected to each other. In fact, Japan and South Korea, two of our closest allies, often have incredibly tense diplomatic relations with each other.
So you have these countries that are in this impossible bind.
A deep bind. Their economy depends on China. Their security depends on the United States.
And both China and the U.S. are increasingly demanding that they choose a side.
Exactly. It forces these nations into what you could almost call a schizophrenic foreign policy. They can't afford to alienate either of the giants.
We've covered the rise, the strategy, the current complexity, but we have to talk about the limits of this model.
We do.
Pemple's work on Japan, he includes this very sobering section called When the Miracle Stalls. I mean, Japan was the unstoppable economic juggernaut in the 1980s.
People were terrified of Japan buying up America.
Right. There were cyberpunk novels written about it, and then in 1990, the bubble burst, and they entered the lost decade, which is now, what, 3 lost decades?
Pretty much.
What went wrong?
Pemple argues that the very institutions that created the miracle eventually became the anchors that dragged the economy down. It's a classic case of what political scientists call institutional inertia.
Meaning they couldn't adapt.
They couldn't adapt. Remember that iron triangle we talked about? The politicians, the bureaucrats, and big business.
Ones with the embedded autonomy.
Yes. That triangle was fantastic for catching up. When you know the target, we need to build better steel, we need to build better cars. It's very efficient.
But the world changed.
The world changed. Once Japan had caught up, they needed to shift from imitation to innovation. They needed to lead in uncharted territory, especially in the information technology revolution in software.
And the system wasn't built for that.
The bureaucracy was too rigid. They kept channeling money into the old industries: hardware, construction, paving rivers with concrete, because that's what the political machine was designed to do.
So the bureaucrats were great at following a map, but they were terrible at drawing a new one.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the protectionism that had nurtured their infant industries just ended up protecting inefficient zombie companies that should have been allowed to fail and reallocate their resources.
This all brings us back full circle to the U.S. grand strategy that James Lee described.
It does.
The U.S. spent the entire Cold War building up these developmental states to fight communism, and it worked. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, they're wealthy, stable, and they eventually became democracies.
A huge success story for U.S. foreign policy.
But now we're facing a new reality. We're facing China, a country that is using the exact same developmental state toolkit.
But on a continental scale, and crucially, without the democratic transition.
It's like the Frankenstein moment for U.S. strategists, isn't it?
It is. We validated this model. We proved to the world that state-led capitalism is an incredibly effective tool for rapid modernization. And now, our primary strategic rival is using that exact model to challenge the liberal international order that we built.
And unlike the Soviet Union, which was this economic island we could basically just isolate and contain,
China is the engine of Factory Asia. It's the center of the global supply chain. We are economically conjoined with our main rival.
it creates this security dilemma that is so much harder to solve than the Cold War was. And now the U.S. is debating whether we need to become more like a developmental state ourselves just to compete.
You see it with things like the CHPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. These are massive industrial policies. We are pouring billions of government dollars into subsidizing our own semiconductor industry because we are terrified of falling behind China.
It seems like we're witnessing this strange convergence. To beat the developmental state, we're adopting parts of it.
Which is, in a way, the ultimate validation of the model's power.
Wow. We have covered a huge amount of ground today.
We have.
From the rice paddies of 1950s Korea to the semiconductor fabs of modern Taiwan and the noodle bowl of Asian trade. If I have to boil all this down, what's the one key takeaway for someone trying to make sense of the headlines they see today?
I think the key takeaway is that the East Asian miracle wasn't magic, and it wasn't an accident. It was a product of very specific institutions, bureaucratic autonomy, financial control, that were incubated inside a very specific geopolitical high house that the United States provided during the Cold War.
But the lesson for the future is the most provocative part.
I think so. For the last 30, 40 years, the West has been telling the developing world in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, that the only path to wealth is the Washington Consensus.
Free markets, open trade, small government, privatize everything.
Right. But if you look at East Asia, which is by far the most successful development story in all of human history, the lesson seems to be the exact opposite.
Use the state, manage trade, guide investment.
And so if you are a leader of a developing nation today, and you're looking at China's incredible rise and America's internal struggles, which model looks more attractive to you? The Beijing Consensus is looking increasingly appealing.
That is a profound shift in the global marketplace of ideas. We might be losing the ideological argument, not because our values are wrong, but because their mechanics of growth are just faster.
And that is a challenge that I think will define the next 50 years of international relations.
An incredible summary. Thank you for helping us navigate all of this. It's a complex history, but it is so crucial for understanding why the world looks the way it does right now.
Always a pleasure to dive deep.
And thank you to all of you for listening. If you want to see the charts we talked about, the flying geese formation, that iPhone value breakdown, or if you want to read the full papers by Lee, Pemple, Roderick, and Tan, please check the show notes. We have everything linked there for you. Don't take our word for it. Read the primary sources. Until next time, keep thinking critically.